Welcome to today's episode of Think Change. I'm Sara Pantuliano. At the 2023 annual meeting of the World Economic Forum in Davos 2 years ago, we discussed how definitions of poverty and inequality have shifted in this era of polycrisis. We talked about how policy responses must adapt to these new forms of poverty. The link to that episode is available in the show notes. Well, this year's Davos meeting just wrapped up last week, and the picture is stark. Poverty reduction has stalled, and inequality continues to surge. Nearly a decade ago, countries around the world committed to the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. And the very first one focused on ending poverty in all its forms everywhere by 2030. And while some progress has been made, we remain far off track to achieve this SDG. We've seen recent data from the World Bank that shows that poverty reduction progress occurred before 2015. At the same time, Oxfam's latest annual inequality report reveals that billionaire wealth has risen 3 times faster in 2024 than in 2023. And most billionaire wealth is taken, is not earned. So what's driving this setback? Are policymakers targeting the right priorities? And most importantly, what can be done to shift course? To discuss all this, I am joined by a fantastic panel. Director of ODI Global, Kevin has long been a key voice on education, development finance, and the need for equitable public policy. And Sofia Spreckmann-Cineiro, Chair of the Pledge for Change on Decolonizing Aid and former Secretary General of CARE International. Anthony, let's begin with you. Oxfam's latest annual report on inequality was just launched at the WEF annual meeting last week. Can you walk us through the key findings of the report? And I'm also keen to hear how it has been received in Davos.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm sure you have seen this picture that has been shared widely across the social media as well as in the media outlet of some of the world's richest billionaires who lined up during the US president inauguration just a couple of days ago. And that is exactly what our report is all about. It's discussing about the cropping up of a new class of oligarchy that is increasingly becoming rich at the expense of all of us, teachers, workers, nurses, construction workers. And the sad thing is that this new class of oligarchy is now into our government. I see it here in Kenya. I see it across the countries in the global south, right? We are also seeing it in rich countries. Our report shows that the world's billionaires increased their wealth 3 times faster last year compared to 2023. More than half of the billionaires' wealth is actually from cronyism, from the abuse of monopoly power, as well as from corruption. While a handful of people increasingly becoming richer, billions of people across the world, and this is what our report is showing, that billions of people are actually struggling because of multiple crises that we are facing. People are going to bed hungry. And as you said earlier, the progress to end poverty has actually stalled. And we have shown in our report the number of people who are living in poverty, that is at $6.85 a day, has not changed over the past more than 30 years, since 1990. And why is this the case? There's one thing that governments and international institutions have not really focused on, and that is the impact of inequality in ending poverty. The World Bank is telling us that if we were to reduce inequality by about 2% Gini per year, we would be able to end poverty 3 times faster. I mean, that's massive, and we have clear direction on what needs to happen. The question is, do we have the political will, the commitment from our governments, from our institutions to do exactly that? While some governments would want to help their people, they are dealing with this bankrupting debt crisis. Over 90% of countries have cut the budgets that are supposed to go to education, healthcare, as well as social protection. And the reason why they are doing this is because of the debt crisis that countries, especially in the global south, are facing. More than half of our countries are spending more than a third of their revenue on debt servicing. What that means is that kids are not able to go to school, and if they go to school, they are not able to access quality education because there's no money to hire teachers. Women, our wives, our daughters, our sisters are dying from preventable deaths because they cannot access the quality healthcare that they really need. As just a final thing, as we have been saying, and also reiterating it in this report, it's possible for the world to make the progress that we really need for economies to work for everyone, not just the richest few.
Thanks, Anthony. Let's dig deeper on why this progress on reducing poverty has stalled so much. I mean, we know from World Bank data that in 2022, just 1/3 as many people left extreme poverty as in 2013. And basically, we know that there are 700 million people that are still extremely poor today. And behind these statistics, as Anthony was alluding to, there are real stories. Families that are struggling to rebuild after economic shocks, communities that are navigating very long crises, individuals that face real barriers to building a better life. Kevin, can you share stories from your work that better illustrate these challenges and really reflect on why this progress on poverty reduction has stalled so much, despite this global commitment to end extreme poverty, if that was ever possible?
Thank you, Sarah. Well, I think it clearly was possible. And, the specific, or one of the specific commitments was to eradicate extreme poverty, which is not the $6 poverty that Anthony was talking about. It's a much, much lower bar. About people not having enough to eat. We're talking about people having to make choices between, do I take my daughter to a clinic to try and get treatment for malaria, or does the family get a breakfast this morning? So, this is a really, really stringent and extreme line that we're talking about. So if we start with monetary poverty, in the end, you can make this as complicated as you want, but it comes down to two things. What is the rate of growth, and what share of that growth is captured by people living below the poverty line? The reason I think this report is so important, Sarah, is I always reflect when Tony Blair was Prime Minister in his first term, he was challenged by an MP to talk about inequality and its links to poverty. And he replied by saying very famously, does it really matter to somebody living in poverty in the UK how much David Beckham earns? That was the analogy he drew at the time. And everybody chuckled. But actually, the answer to that question should have been yes, because we know from so many, look at the countries that have really reduced poverty in recent years. Brazil is a standout example. Brazil cut poverty by slightly increasing taxation. It was a period of relatively high growth, but it invested the taxation in social protection programs, cash transfer programs. In other words, they took money from people who had too much and gave money to people who had too little. So there's a really big question about how do you make and win the political argument for the type of redistribution that Anthony is talking about. And I guess my take on this is, I mean, clearly inheritance tax should be going up. Clearly, we should be investing more in the regulation and of monopoly power. And in some ways, Europe has done quite a good job of that. But we also need to win the case for the sort of proposals that Gabriel Zucman in the Paris School of Economics has made for global billionaire tax. We need to win the case nationally. And my take on winning the case, and I'll close after this, is that you have to find areas where you can demonstrate to the public that doing this is not just about a punitive measure against billionaires. It's doing something that is in the common good in a way that will improve the lived experience of most people. For example, investing in strategies that counter hunger. That's clearly a good thing in itself, but it's also tackling one of the greatest sources of inefficiency in the world today. Investing in school feeding programs, investing in social protection. These are investments that generate a very wide dispersion of benefits that I think are easily communicable and therefore winnable in terms of political economy engagement.
Sophia, Anthony and Kevin are clearly highlighting the systemic issues that are at the heart of the problem, wealth accumulation. In fact, really unbridled wealth accumulations, regressive taxation, structural inequalities. How do we get policymakers to focus on the right priorities?
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Anthony and Kevin, for what you already laid out, which I, of course, wholeheartedly agree with. And maybe just in synthesis and to add a point here, which I think is crucial. I mean, we're seeing billionaires not only accumulating wealth in huge mass, but also shaping politics. And that is, of course, enormous. And countries facing enormous levels of indebtedness, ODA commitments not only being not met, but actually right now, really, we're seeing even a freezing of aid with the latest executive orders by the US, taxation rules being decided without all the countries around the table. They're decided in OECD and not at UN level. And then, of course, decision makers taking a choice for regressive taxation, which increases poverty and inequality. And then, of course, the austerity measures being put in place at country level and international level. All of this together, I think, is this toxic combination, which means that financing isn't invested in core sectors. But here, let me bring in, Sarah, a crucial point, and you will not be surprised that I'm saying this, given my passion for gender equality. If also inequality remains a major driver of global instability, and by virtue of impacting at least half of the population, gender inequality is one of the best barometers we have to measure whether services and systems and structures are discriminatory and ineffective or effective. And therefore, I think this is where a strategic lens needs to be placed to address some of the root causes. And here we're moving backwards and not forwards. The geopolitical shifts we are witnessing are devastating for equality, but particularly gender equality. So I think we actually need to act on gender equality and women's justice and rights very, very urgently, because gender equality is not only kind of an individual thematic area, but is an essential lever to the development work, to effective development work, and to tackling poverty and achieve SDGs. Because women and girls are really kind of trapped in this paradox. They contribute the least to conflicts, global crisis, climate change, but are disproportionately affected by the catastrophic consequences of this all. And in addition, we all know that women and girls perform an inequitable amount of unpaid care work, which increases in times of crisis. If unpaid care alone is estimated to add 10.8 trillion to the global economy each year, so that's the equivalent of 9% of global gross domestic product. In a way, it's something. Care is the global good that everyone in a society and economy benefits from. And of course, in a way, women and girls are subsidizing, the economy in a huge way, and economic growth in every country in the world. And here the US is, of course, a huge example in that regard. And none of this is in the public domain of dialogue, and policymakers are kind of not attempting to bring this forward, and this unpaid care work and the time poverty for women and girls and for women's economic justice and rights. And at the same time, the care sector is one of the fastest growing sectors globally. And that is promising 150 million new jobs by 2030. So, if all of this is tied together in a meaningful way, there might be opportunity, but it's not in the public discourse, and we are just wasting time, and time is pressing right now. So in the midst of this huge paradox, women are nonetheless rolling up their sleeves and providing meaningful leadership on a global scale, not just in high office, but within their communities, making a difference where it matters most. So here, I think, since their expertise is undervalued, despite the strong rhetoric from governments, and women's and girls' organizations are chronically underfunded and underrepresented in key decisions, this is where there is transformative potential, and I may say a golden opportunity to make progress, which is right now being missed. Sarah, policymakers are therefore not focusing on the right priorities. They have not focused on these severe inequalities, and we are witnessing this pushback against women and girls, and people facing discrimination in general. So this is, of course, in itself means that systems are not working equitably. And it should be on decision makers' top priority to address these injustices.
It should, but in reality, it isn't. And this is, the challenge. Kevin, you were suggesting already some key actions that policymakers could take. But, Sophia has illustrated the context in which this policymaking should happen. And I just struggle to see how we can push policymakers, certain policymakers, to introduce, to promote more equitable public policy. What should we do?
I think there are really two important points here, because agreeing on the problem in the end is not all that difficult. I think the Oxfam report has outlined the scale of billionaire wealth. It's clearly dysfunctional. It's clearly not justified by any sort of market efficiency criteria. Sophia has outlined the reality of gender disparities and inequalities, which in many areas are either narrowing way too slowly or they're not narrowing at all. And yet when we look around the political world, you look around Europe, you look around much of Latin America, you look around much of sub-Saharan Africa as well, the politics are pulling in a very different direction. How do you initiate a dialogue on these issues of equity in a way that builds coalitions for change rather than provides a pathway to political disaster? So to my mind, Sarah, that is the tax, that is the exam question we're all facing. And the way I guess I believe it needs to be addressed, there's a narrative aspect to this, which is to say we have to find the political language that doesn't alienate potential allies, that speaks to the real experience of people, the real needs and demands that they have as a community. I mean, to give one example, Sarah, taxation, Colombia has very recently introduced a very significant tax on ultra-processed foods and sugar-intensive foods. And it did so using a narrative that explained to the population that this was about tackling the country's obesity crisis. It was about mobilizing the revenues that could be invested in healthy diets for children in schools, putting money into health. If you look at the Philippine sin tax experience, it was the same sort of constellation. It was, you know, making the case for taxation as a source of revenue that would create what was in effect a national health service. So those are examples, I think, of where progressive coalitions have come together to make and win a case for taxation. We need that sort of coalition behind Gabriel Zucman's proposal for a billionaire wealth tax. I mean, of course, it's much more difficult, but I guess maybe, Sarah, it's an area to explore of how, you know, how do you build a coalition for reform?
That has been exactly what we as ODI Global have been trying to do in Davos, and the conversations we have convened have been really focused on trying to create coalitions that go beyond the usual suspects, you know, beyond, you know, the traditional development sector, including with businesses, you know, other leaders that are like-minded and can influence policy making. And Anthony, in fact, I wanted to ask you if you've seen any example of any such coalitions emerging as you were researching the Oxfam report.
We did this one a couple of years ago to try to bring together a group of progressive countries that can set a good example for others to follow. The problem is with that is that once maybe a prime minister or a president, leaves the office, that thing dies from there. I think the hardest thing is to institutionalize some of these progressive initiatives that we as NGOs try to come up with. Because we have that Zucman sort of a task force that is targeting, that are wealthy people. I think we should also be able to come up with another sort of an initiative that is focusing really on inequality, especially setting good examples for others to follow. And finally, one of the things, because sometimes we keep on blaming governments, especially here in the global south, but if you're just spending more than 60% of your debt, of your revenue servicing debt, for heaven's sake, when are you going to fund schools, at clinics, and build roads? We have been very vocal on this, that countries, especially countries of the global south, we need a lot of support in tackling the debt crisis, because no matter, doesn't matter how progressive your government is, but if they do not have the money to spend on their people, what they have is going to someone else, and we are not going to go far. And that is why we have been saying that, the IMF, the International Finance Institution, as well as rich countries, should come together and try to sort out the current debt crisis that we are facing.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right, and this is something we've covered a lot on Think Change, and the debt crisis is real. That doesn't mean, though, that governments shouldn't look at the structural inequalities and the issues with regressive taxation that make poverty all the harder to fight. We're almost at time, but Sophia, I just want to close with you, because you're also a board member of the International Budget Partnership, which stresses the importance of transparent and equitable public spending in the fight against poverty and inequality. What key lessons can we take from your work?
Thank you, Sarah. I guess, well, one of the main issues we are now facing is that we are at this inflection point to fight inequality, and that inequality actually undermines the promise of democracy for delivering for all. And I do think that around the world, people are actually hungry to be more engaged in the political process and for their elected officials to be more representative, competent, and responsive to their needs. So it is about restoring that vital relationship between governments and their people. And there we need more space for everyone to influence how public money is raised and spent. Obviously, those that have been systematically excluded from accessing those public goods and services even more so. And here, I think the main lessons for leveraging their input and for tackling structural inequality and restore people's faith in democracy. So here, I think the main lessons are that public finances must be linked to clear development objectives, so that public goods and services reach everyone, and particularly those that have been excluded. This is the difficult thing to sell. But very often the systems related to financial management of public money through the state budget do not consider those real priorities. And there, people just must be engaged. And of course, then the design and implementation of public policies must include civil society throughout the cycle. Design, implementation, evaluation in real and influential spaces for participation. And again, this is very, very hard to achieve. Maybe there are a few opportunities coming up relatively soon, like the Financing for Development conference might be in later this year an opportunity to shift the dial, to integrate some of these perspectives in the approaches that governments will take. But I must say, right now, hope is of course not exactly huge given what we're seeing in the world, but we must keep pushing to shift the dial on these systemic issues. And prioritize real system change that also integrates, and forgive me for mentioning this again, a gender lens across the financing for development approaches overall.
Sarah, just to add, it's why ODI is so important, actually, because, you know, I mean, when I was in ODI, we all used to reflect on this misalignment. You know, there's so much evidence that points in one direction, and yet policymakers go in another direction. And I think we, you know, maybe there's a bit of a tendency on the part of progressive political forces to be a little bit self-righteous. You know, this is so obviously the right thing to do, the fair thing to do, the just thing to do. And it's unbelievable that governments aren't already doing it. And all we need to do is put out a report, make a statement, and all of a sudden they're going to jump to attention. If we can find a language that's honest, appeals to basic fairness, and you have to find ways of talking to people. And in a way, I think that's really our biggest challenge right now.
Thank you, Sophia, Anthony, and Kevin, for your very valuable insights today. Something we've stressed consistently in our work at ODI Global is that poverty is inherently political. And it is political action that we need if you want to challenge the power structures that make and keep people poor, and to push them to develop appropriate policies that support people properly. And I think it's important to stress that poverty is not just about money. It's about the other assets people have, you know, tangible assets like a good education, access to adequate healthcare, digital access, and intangible assets like social capital and access to network. This is something we've done quite a bit of work on at ODI. But underpinning it all, you know, both tangible assets and intangible assets, different forms of poverty, is this rampant inequality that we've discussed today. inequality that political leaders have allowed to fester and which is leading, or actually has led, to broken and dysfunctional societies with all the attendant instability that is characterizing the age we live in. And if we continue to ignore the urgency to tackle, what are really devastating consequences of inequality, I think we do that at our peril. Whether it's through progressive taxation, wealth redistribution, stronger social protection, any of the actions we've discussed today, we just can't continue to ignore where this has led us. And any real change won't happen in silos. It is going to take all of us, committed business, government, civil society, to work together to help build fairer societies. But that's all we have time for today. Thanks everyone for joining us. You can subscribe to Think Change from your preferred podcast platform. You can also follow our Blue Sky and LinkedIn if you want to hear more about the conversations, and do consider leaving us a review if you are enjoying the show. Until next time, thanks for listening.